Hi, I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. My daughter-in-law has not slept in the same room as my son in 26 days. I know the exact number because she told me. She told me on a phone call last Tuesday at 3 in the morning her time, from a house in London, and she said the number out loud like a person reading a thermometer. 26 days. She is in England. He is in Missouri, at a training camp, sleeping in a dormitory room at a state university like a 19-year-old, because that is what the Kansas City Chiefs do every summer and have done for 16 straight years, and will keep doing, regardless of who anybody married in July. They have been married for 6 weeks. Now, I know what happens when a sentence like that goes out into the world. I have watched what this internet does with less. I have seen people take a photograph of my son standing 4 feet from his wife instead of 2 feet and build an entire week of content out of it. So let me get ahead of it. There is nothing wrong. There is nothing wrong, and there has not been anything wrong, and if you have come here hoping there is something wrong, I am going to disappoint you in about 90 seconds, and I would rather you know that now. But there is a reason. There is a very specific reason that these two people are currently 4,000 miles apart, and there is a very specific set of rules they have built around it, and those rules came from somewhere. They came from my kitchen table. They came from a conversation I had with Taylor Swift in May of this year, 6 weeks before her wedding, in which I told her something about my own marriage that I have never said out loud to anybody, including my sons. And she took it, and she did something with it that I did not expect. So that is what this is. That is what I want to tell you today. 26 days. And why neither of them is worried about it. Let me start with last Tuesday, because that is where I am standing. August 2026. My phone rang at 10 o'clock at night my time, which made it 3 in the morning in London. I want to say something about that immediately. Taylor Swift does not call people at 3 in the morning. She is, of all the people I know, the most careful about other people's time. She checks time zones. She asks if you are busy. She has a horror of imposing that I have written about elsewhere, and that took her and Kylie Kelce a full year to get past. So when my phone rang at 10 at night and it was her, I knew before I picked up that she had not slept. I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "Nothing's wrong. I'm sorry. Did I wake you?" I said, "Taylor, it's 3 in the morning where you are." And she said, "I know." There was a pause. And then she said, "I can't sleep, and I've done the whole list, and I ran out of things on the list." I said, "What's the list?" And she said, "Read, tea, don't look at the phone, look at the phone, get up, walk around, lie back down, count." She said, "I've done it twice." I sat down on the edge of my bed in Cleveland, Ohio. I said, "How long has it been?" And she said, 26 days. She did not have to explain what she was counting. I knew immediately. And that is when I understood that the thing I told her in May had gone somewhere much deeper than I had intended. I need to back up and explain the situation, for anybody who has not been following the logistics of these two people's lives, which is most sane human beings. Travis went to training camp on July 29th. The Chiefs report to Missouri Western State University in St. Joseph every summer. It is a real training camp in the old-fashioned sense. The players live on campus, in dorms, away from home, for weeks. It is deliberate. It is designed to remove distractions and force a group of men to become a team again. Travis Kelce is 36 years old. He has done this 14 times. He signed a contract that says he will do it. He went. Taylor, meanwhile, had commitments in England that had been on a calendar for a very long time. Work, the kind of work that involves other people's schedules and other people's money and cannot simply be moved because you got married in July. She went. So they are apart. Not estranged, not struggling. Apart. in the ordinary way that two people with enormous careers are sometimes apart, except that in their case, apart means an ocean. This is not new information. It has been in the papers. People have written about the fact that they are living in different countries 6 weeks into a marriage, and some of those pieces have been fine, and some of them have had a tone that I do not care for. But here is the part almost nobody has right. They have rules. Not vague intentions, not we'll try to talk when we can, actual, specific, written down, non-negotiable rules that they made together before he left, and that they have not broken once. I know all of them because I was there when the first one got made. Here is the conversation. May 2026. My kitchen in Cleveland. Taylor was there for 2 days. She had come to Ohio for reasons that were partly wedding-related, and partly, I think, because she likes my house, which is a thing I still cannot entirely process. It was the second night. Ed had gone to bed. It was maybe 11:30. We were at the kitchen table with the overhead light off, and just the light over the stove on, which is how I sit in that room at night, and always have. And she said, "Can I ask you something that's going to sound morbid?" I said, "Those are the good ones." She said, "How did you and Ed do it?" I said, "Do what?" She said, "The football. The years of it. He was coaching, you were working, the boys were playing, and then the boys were both in the NFL in 2 different cities. How many years was it where you were basically running an operation instead of having a marriage?" I said, "About 20. She said, "How did it survive that?" And I want to tell you what I almost said, because I think it matters. I almost said the thing you say. I almost said, "You just get through it. You know, you make it work. We were lucky." That is what I have said for 50 years when anybody asks me that. It is a nice answer, and it is completely useless, and it is the kind of thing older women say to younger women to protect them from information they think they cannot use yet. I looked at her sitting at my table at 11:30 at night, 6 weeks from marrying my son, asking me a real question, and I decided to tell her the truth. I said, "It almost didn't." She went very still. I said, "There was a period. I am not going to tell you exactly when because it involves other people, but there was a period of about 18 months where Ed and I were not a marriage. We were 2 people running the same household from different rooms." I said, "Nothing happened. There was no dramatic thing. Nobody did anything wrong." I said, "What happened was that we got busy, and then we got tired, and then we got efficient, and efficient is where it goes to die." She did not say anything. She was watching me the way she watches things, which is completely. I said, "At some point you start dividing tasks instead of sharing a life. He handles that, I handle this. And it works. It works so well. The house runs better than it has ever run. And you tell yourself, 'We're doing great. Look how well this is running.'" I said, "And then one night, you look across the room at the man you married, and you realize you have not asked him a single question in about 4 months that was not logistical." I said, "Not one." 4 months of who's picking up Jason? What time is the thing? Did you call about the water heater? 4 months of running an extremely efficient operation with a man whose interior life had become completely unknown to me. I said, "And the terrible part, Taylor, is that it did not feel like a crisis." That is what nobody tells you. It does not feel like anything. It feels fine. It feels like a busy season. I said, "It took me 18 months to notice." She said, very quietly, "How did you notice?" And this is the part I have never told anybody. I said, "He got sick. Nothing serious. A flu, a bad one, the kind that puts a big strong man flat for 4 days. This was, I want to say 1996, somewhere in there. Both boys were at school. Ed was in bed in the middle of the afternoon, which never happened, which had never once happened in our marriage before that week. And I brought him something. Soup, tea, I do not remember. and I sat down on the edge of the bed because he was awake, and I could not think of anything to say to him. I want you to understand that sentence. I sat on the edge of the bed I had slept in for over 20 years, next to a man I had known since I was young, and I could not think of one single thing to say to him that was not about the house. I sat there for probably 40 seconds trying to find a question, and then Ed, who was sick, who had a fever, who was half asleep, Ed opened his eyes and looked at me and said, "Hi, just hi," and I burst into tears. I told Taylor this at my kitchen table in May, and I had not told it to my own sons, and I do not entirely know why I told it to her, except that she asked a real question, and it seemed like a betrayal to give her the easy answer. She said, "What did he do?" I said, "He moved over." I said he was flat on his back with a fever, and he moved over about 8 inches to make room, and he said, "Come here." I said, and I lay down on top of the covers in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, next to my sick husband, and I did not say anything, and neither did he, for about an hour. I said, and that was the beginning of coming back. She said, "An hour of not talking?" And I said, "An hour of not being efficient." She asked me something else that night that I have not been able to get rid of. She said, "Were you ever going to leave?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Why not?" I want to explain why that question landed the way it did. Because the easy answer is, because I loved him, and that answer is true, and it is also completely useless, and she would have known it was useless the second it came out of my mouth. So I sat there and I thought about it properly. And I said, "Because I didn't notice in time to leave." She said, "What does that mean?" I said, "Leaving is a thing you do when you're angry. Anger has energy in it. Anger gets you out of a house." I said, "What happened to us was not anger. There was nothing to be angry about. He hadn't done anything, and I hadn't done anything, and there was no scene to have and nobody to blame." I said, "You cannot leave over efficiency. There's nothing to point at." I said, "So instead, you just get quieter and quieter, and one day you're 50, and you live with a nice man you don't know anything about, and everybody says, 'What a lovely long marriage.'" She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "That's the most frightening thing anybody's ever said to me." And I said, "Good." Then she asked me a question that told me exactly what she was actually thinking about, and it took me a second to catch up. She said, "How did you know it wasn't just what marriage is?" I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "At some point, somebody must have told you that's normal. That the passion goes and it becomes a partnership, and that's the natural progression, and it's fine." She said, "Everybody says that. It's in every article about marriage ever written. The love changes into something quieter and deeper." She said, "How did you know that wasn't what was happening to you?" And I sat at my kitchen table and understood that this young woman was 6 weeks from her wedding and was terrified that the thing she had with my son was going to be permitted to fade by everybody around her, on the grounds that fading is what it does. I said, "Because quieter and deeper is not the same as further apart." I said, "Those two things get confused all the time, and they are opposites." I said, "Quieter and deeper means you need fewer words to say more. Further apart means you have fewer words and you are saying less." I said, "From the outside they look identical, two people not talking much. From the inside, they are not remotely the same thing, and you always know which one you are in." I said, I knew because I could not think of a question to ask my own husband. I said, "If you have ever sat across from somebody and had a whole conversation in 10 words, you are fine. If you have ever sat across from somebody and could not find 10 words, you are not." She said, "That's a good test." And I said, "It's the only test I've got." Then I told her the rest of it, which is the part that matters for what she did afterward. I said, "After that we made a rule. Just one, We were not fancy about it. We did not have a system. I said, the rule was that no matter what happened during the day, no matter how the day went, we did not go to sleep without saying something to each other that was not about logistics. I said, it did not have to be deep. Most nights it was not deep. Most nights it was one sentence. But it could not be about the schedule, and it could not be about the boys, and it could not be about the house. She said, that's it? I said, that's it. She said, and that worked? And I said, Taylor, we are 50+ years in. Yes, it worked. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, how many nights did you break it? I said, what? She said, how many nights in 50 years did you not do it? And I thought about it. I actually thought about it, sitting there, because it was a good question, and nobody had ever asked it. I said, I don't know exactly. Not many, maybe a dozen times total, and every single one of them was because one of us was on an airplane. And Taylor Swift said, so it's basically never been broken. And I said, basically never. And she said, okay. She said it in a specific way. She said it the way people say things when they have just decided something. I did not know what she had decided. I found out on July 29th. Travis called me the night before he left for camp. He said, Mom, can I tell you something Taylor did? I said, always. He said, she wrote something down. He explained. 2 nights before he was due to leave, Taylor had sat down with him and said she wanted to make some agreements. Not vague ones, actual ones, written down, because she said, and Travis quoted this to me, she said, I don't trust either of us to remember our own intentions when we're tired. I don't trust either of us to remember our own intentions when we're tired. That is one of the wisest sentences I have ever heard a person under 40 say. There were 3 of them. Travis told me all 3 that night on the phone, and I wrote them down myself afterward, on the back of an envelope, which is still in a drawer in my kitchen. Rule 1. We talk every day. Not text. Talk, voice or face, at least once, no matter how short. Rule 2. We do not go to sleep without saying goodnight to each other. Ever. Not once. Rule 3. We are never apart more than 10 days without one of us getting on a plane. If work threatens the 10 days, work moves. Travis said, she's got them written on a card. She gave me a copy. I said, where's yours? And he said, slightly sheepishly, in my bag. I said, Travis. And he said, it's in my bag, Mom. It's not lost. It's in the front pocket. I have to tell you about Ed, because there is a piece of this that involves him, and he does not know I am telling it. Actually, that is not true. He does know. I asked him. 2 days after Taylor called me at 3 in the morning, I was in the kitchen, and Ed came through, and I said, I need to tell you something. And he said, okay. I said, I told Taylor about 1996. He stopped. He put down whatever he was holding. He said, which part? And I said, all of it. And Ed Kelce stood in our kitchen and did not say anything for probably 15 seconds. Then he said, the flu? I said, the flu. He said, the 8 inches? I said, yes. And my husband, who is 70-something years old, and has said perhaps 4 sentimental sentences in the entire time I have known him, said, good. I said, you're not upset? And he said, why would I be upset? I said, because it's private. And he said, Donna, it's the best thing that ever happened to us. Why would I want it private? I sat down at the kitchen table. He said, does Travis know? I said, no. And Ed said, you should tell him. I said, I don't know how. And he said, same way you told her. Just say it. I have not told him yet. I want to be honest about that. I am telling all of you, before I have told my own son. which is a strange thing to do, and which I am aware of. I think I am telling it this way because it is easier. I think that is probably the whole reason. But Ed said one more thing that afternoon, and it is the reason I finally decided to make this whole thing public. He said, "You know what I remember about that afternoon?" I said, "What?" And he said, "I remember thinking, oh no, she's been alone in here with me for a year." He said, "I had a fever of 102, and that's what I thought. She's been alone in here with me for a year." He said, "And I couldn't fix it, and I couldn't say it, and all I could do was move over." And then Ed Kelce, standing in our kitchen in Cleveland in August of 2026, said, "So if moving over 8 inches 30 years ago is what's keeping those two kids together across an ocean right now, then that's the best 8 inches I ever moved, and you can tell the whole world about it." Then he picked up whatever he had put down and left the room. 50 plus years. That is what I have been married to for 50 plus years. Rule 2 is the one that has been in the papers. Somebody found out about the good night thing. I do not know how. I have my suspicions, and they are all uninteresting. And it got written up as a sweet celebrity habit, the bedtime rule, the non-negotiable. They got it right, more or less. The reporting was accurate. What nobody had was where it came from. It came from a bedroom in Euclid, Ohio, in approximately 1996, where a woman who could not think of anything to say to her own husband lay down on top of the covers in the middle of the afternoon because he moved over 8 inches and said, "Come here." That is the origin of the rule that 30 years later is keeping a marriage intact across an ocean. I did not know I was handing her that. I thought I was telling a story about my own life. She heard an instruction. Now let me come back to 26 days. Because you have noticed the problem, and if you have not, let me point at it. Rule 3 says 10 days. It has been 26. That is why she called me at 3 in the morning. Here is what happened, and I want to be fair to both of them, because there is no villain in this. The London work expanded, not dramatically, in the ordinary way that work expands. A thing that was supposed to take 8 days took 11, and then something else got added because she was already there and it was efficient, and then a date shifted by a week because of somebody else's calendar. Nobody did anything wrong. Meanwhile, Travis is in a dormitory in St. Joseph, Missouri, under a schedule that is not his to negotiate. Camp is camp. You cannot leave camp in the middle of camp because your wife is in England. Day 10 came and went. And here is the thing I want you to understand, because it is the entire point of this story. They both saw it coming. Neither of them said anything. For 16 days. She told me the whole shape of it on that phone call last Tuesday. She said, "I knew on day 7 that we weren't going to make it." I said, "Why didn't you say anything?" And she said, and her voice did something on this part. She said, "Because he's at camp." She said, "He's 36 years old, and he's trying to have one more good season, and he is up at 5 in the morning doing a thing that is very hard on his body. And I am not going to be the phone call that adds a problem to that." I said, "Taylor." She said, "I know." I said, "What did he say?" And she said, "Same thing. Backwards." She said, "He called me on day 12, and I asked him if the 10-day thing was bothering him, and he said no. And I said, okay." She said, "And I knew he was lying, and he knew I knew, and we both let it go, because he didn't want to be the one who made me feel guilty about work, and I didn't want to be the one who made him feel guilty about camp." She said, "We were both being generous." And then she said the sentence, that is the reason I am telling this story at all. She said, "Donna, we were being generous at each other for 2.5 weeks, and it turned into the exact thing you described at your kitchen table." She said, "We got efficient." I sat on the edge of my bed in Cleveland at 10 o'clock at night. She said, "We've talked every day. Every single day. We have not missed one." And we say goodnight every night. We have never broken that one. Not once. Not even when the time zones are stupid, she said. And last night, I hung up the phone and realized I could not tell you one thing he'd said to me in 9 days that wasn't about his schedule or my schedule. She said, 9 days of who's where, what's the flight, how's the shoulder, did you eat? She said, we're following the rules and we hollowed them out. And she said, I did exactly what you said, and I did it in 3 weeks instead of 18 months. Before I tell you what I said, I have to give you Travis's version of those 26 days, because I got it from him on Sunday, and it is worse than hers. He told me what his nights looked like. Camp is not a hotel. I want people to understand this, because I do not think most people do. Missouri Western State University is a state school, and the chiefs stay in the dormitories. Actual dormitories, cinder block walls, a twin bed that is too short for a man who is 6'5", fluorescent light in the hallway that comes under the door. Travis Kelce has slept in that room every summer for 14 years. He said, it's fine. It's always been fine. You're so tired you don't care. He said, it wasn't fine this year. I said, why not? And he said, because I'd never had anything to miss before. He said it just like that, flat, like a man reporting a finding. He said, 14 years I've been in that room, and it's just a room. And this year I'd lie down at 10:30, and the ceiling was, he stopped. He said, the ceiling was very close. I said, Travis. He said, it's stupid. I said, it is not stupid. He said, Mom, I'm 36 years old, and I'm homesick. In a dorm, like a freshman. And I said, you're not homesick, you're wife-sick. It's different, and it's newer, and you've never had it before, so of course you don't recognize it. There was a long pause on that phone. And he said, yeah. Okay, that's it. He said, that's exactly it. Then he told me about the goodnight calls. He said the time difference is brutal, 6 hours, which means her bedtime is his late afternoon, and his bedtime is the middle of her night. So one of them is always calling in to the wrong part of their own day. He said, for the first week we were doing it at her bedtime, so I'd be sitting in the locker room at 4 in the afternoon, still in my gear, saying goodnight to my wife. He said, and then I'd have 6 more hours of my day, and then I'd go to bed alone with no goodnight, because we'd already done it. I said, oh. And he said, yeah. He said, so around day 9 I switched it. I said, let's do it at my bedtime instead. And she said, fine. He said, which means she's now getting a phone call at 4:30 in the morning, her time, every night, for 17 days. I said, Travis, she's not sleeping. And he said, I know that now. He said she never said, not once. She picked up every single time sounding completely awake, and I never once thought about what 4:30 in the morning means. He said, I did that. That's mine. And I said, she agreed to it. And Travis said, Mom, she agrees to everything. That's not a defense. I have thought about that a great deal since Sunday. She agrees to everything. That's not a defense. He is right, and I think it may be the most important thing my son has figured out about his wife in 3 years. Taylor Swift will say fine to almost anything. Not because she is a pushover, she is one of the most decisive people I have ever met, and if you have ever watched her make a business decision, you would not describe her as accommodating. But in the small domestic things, in the what time should we do the call things, she defers. Instantly and completely and every time. I asked her about it once, months ago, and she gave me an answer I have not stopped thinking about. She said, when everything about your life inconveniences everybody around you, you get very reluctant to ask for anything else. She said, I already cost people so much. The security, the schedules, the fact that nobody can just meet me somewhere. All of that is already on the table before I open my mouth. She said, so when it's something small, I just say yes. It feels like the least I can do. And I said, Taylor, that's how people end up alone in a room at 4:30 in the morning. And she said, yeah, I'm aware. I want to tell you what I said to her, because I have thought about it since, and I believe I got it right, which is not something I always get to say. I said, no, you did the opposite. She said, what? I said, it took me 18 months to notice, and I only noticed because my husband got the flu. I said, you noticed on day 26 because you were watching for it. I said, that is not the same failure. That is the same shape, but it is not the same failure. And the difference between them is the entire thing. I said, I did not have a name for it in 1996. I did not know what was happening to me. I thought I was tired. I said, you have a name for it. You knew what you were looking at within 3 weeks. And you called somebody at 3 in the morning to say it out loud, which is the single hardest part, and the part that almost nobody does. She was quiet. I said, Taylor, you did not fail the rule. You noticed the rule was not enough. Those are different things, and you should be extremely proud of the second one. And she said, I don't feel proud. And I said, I know. You feel tired. Feeling proud comes later, usually about a year later, usually when you're doing something else entirely. Then I said, what are you going to do? And she said, I already did it. She had called Travis before she called me, at what would have been about 9 at night his time. And she had said, this is her account of it. She had said, I want to add a rule. And he said, okay. And she said, I don't want to talk about logistics on the last call of the day. Anything else is fine, but the last one has to be something else. And there was a pause on his end. And Travis said, yeah, I know. And she said, you know? And he said, I've been thinking the same thing for like a week, and I didn't want to say it, because I thought it would sound like I was complaining about being busy. Both of them, independently, for a week, sitting on the same observation and not saying it, because each one thought saying it would be a burden on the other one. She said to me, how long would we have gone? And I said, honestly, with 2 people as considerate as you two, a long time. I said, considerate is more dangerous than careless. Careless people at least make noise. I called Kylie on Wednesday. I want to explain why, because I do not usually do this. I do not usually go around the family talking about one person's business to another person. That is a thing I have a rule about. I called Kylie because I was worried, and because Kylie is the only other person in this family who has done a version of what Taylor is currently doing. Kylie Kelce spent 8 years married to a professional football player. She has done the seasons. She has done the training camps. She has done the part where your husband disappears in July and comes back in February as a slightly different man with new injuries and a new relationship to sleep. She has done it with 4 children. I said, I need to ask you something about camp. And Kylie said, is this about Taylor? I said, how did you know? And Kylie said, because it's the 3rd week of August and she's in England, and she's never done this before. She said, I've been waiting for somebody to call me. Kylie told me something that afternoon that I want to put down exactly. She said, the first camp is the worst one, not because it's the longest, because it's the one where you find out. I said, find out what? And she said, that the marriage doesn't automatically survive it. She said, everybody thinks the wedding is the thing. The wedding is not the thing. The first time your husband disappears into a schedule that does not care about you is the thing. She said, Jason left for camp about 4 months after we got married. And I remember standing in the driveway, watching the car go and thinking, oh, this is what it is now. I said, what did you do? And she said, I got very good at being fine. She said, I got so good at being fine that it took me about 3 years to figure out that being fine was a problem. She said, Donna, I did not tell that man one true thing about how I was doing for 3 entire football seasons. Not one. He'd call and I'd say, We're good. Everything's good. Don't worry about us. Focus on the season. She said, and I meant it. I thought I was being a good wife. And then she said, I was being a wall. I asked her what changed it. She said, he came home in February one year and asked me how the fall had been, and I said fine. And he said no, actually, how was it? She said, and I started crying so hard I had to sit on the floor. She said, I hadn't cried in 5 months. Not once. I'd been fine for 5 months. Then Kylie said, so if you're asking me what Taylor should do, the answer is, she should not get good at being fine. She said, she should be extremely bad at it. She should be terrible at it. She should call him at 4 in the morning and say, I can't sleep, and I hate this, and I miss you, every single time it's true. She said, because the alternative is that in 3 years she'll be very good at it, and he won't know anything about her anymore. I said, they made a rule. And Kylie said, what rule? And I told her about the last call not being about the day. There was a pause. And Kylie Kelce said, she figured that out in 3 weeks? I said, yes. And Kylie said, it took me 3 years. She said it without any bitterness at all. She said it the way you say something about a person you are proud of. Then she said, tell her I said good. And tell her that when it's football season, and he's losing, and she's got her own thing going, that rule is going to be very hard to keep, and she should keep it anyway. Then she said, and Donna? I said yes. And she said, tell her she can call me. At 4 in the morning, any night. She said, I've been up. So the fourth rule now exists. It is written on the same card. Travis added it in his own handwriting, which I have seen a photograph of, and which is genuinely terrible handwriting for a grown man. Rule 4. The last call of the day is not about the day. That is it. That is the whole rule. And here is what has happened since Tuesday, which is 6 days ago. He called her at 11 at night, his time on Wednesday, and asked her what the light was like in the room she was in. That was the whole call. 4 minutes. What is the light like in the room you are in? She told me about it on Thursday, and she was, I do not have a good word. Lit up is close, she said. He asked me about the light, Donna. On Thursday she called him and asked him what he was afraid of this season. She said he did not answer for a second, and then he told her, and it took 11 minutes, and it was not the answer she expected. On Friday, apparently, they talked for 6 minutes about a dog they saw on the internet. On Saturday, she asked him what he thought his father would say about something, and he could not answer that one either, and he called her back 2 hours later after practice with an answer. That is what has been happening for 6 days. 4 to 11 minutes a night, about nothing. And a woman who could not sleep at 3 in the morning last Tuesday told me on the phone yesterday that she has slept through the night 3 nights running. I want to give you the 6 calls, because Taylor told me about all of them, and because they are the whole payoff of this story, and I would be cheating you if I summarized them. Wednesday, he asked her about the light. She said she had been sitting in a room in a house in London at around 11 at night, having not slept properly in about a week, and the phone rang at exactly the time it always rings, and she picked it up, braced for the schedule conversation. And he said, "What's the light like in there?" She said, "What?" And he said, "In the room. What's it doing?" She said she looked up. She said, There's a lamp on the far side and it's making everything sort of amber, and the window's open and there's a street light outside doing something blue at the edge." And he said, "Amber and blue." And she said, "Yeah." And he said, "That sounds nice." And she said, "It is nice." And then he said, "Okay, good night. I love you." And that was the call. 4 minutes. She said, "Donna, I put the phone down and I cried for 10 minutes. I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because it was the first time in 3 weeks that somebody asked me a question I couldn't answer wrong." Thursday, she asked him what he was afraid of this season. She said he did not answer for about 4 seconds, which for Travis is an extremely long time. And then he told her. She would not tell me all of it, and I did not ask. She told me the shape. She said, "He's afraid this is the last one." Not because anybody's told him, because his body's been saying something all summer that he hasn't wanted to translate. She said, "And he's afraid that if it is the last one, he's going to spend the whole season knowing it, and he doesn't know how to play a season while knowing that." She said, 11 minutes. He talked for 11 minutes. She said, "He has never said any of that to anybody. He hasn't said it to Jason. He hasn't said it to you." I said, "I know he hasn't said it to me." And she said, "I'm sorry." And I said, "Don't be sorry. That's what you're for." Friday. The dog. There is not much to this one. Somebody had sent her a video of a dog doing something, and she sent it to him, and they talked about it for 6 minutes. She said, "That's it. That's the whole call. It was a very good dog." I said, "How was it?" And she said, "It was the best one." Saturday. She asked him what he thought Ed would say about something. I do not know what the something was. She did not tell me, and I did not press. But she said he could not answer it, and that he said, "I need to think about that," and that he called her back 2 hours later after practice with an answer. She said, "He called me back, Donna, 2 hours later, from the parking lot, still in his gear." She said, "He'd been thinking about it during practice." Sunday. He asked her what she was going to do with the record. Not in the business sense. She said he asked her what she wanted it to feel like. She said, "Nobody asks that. Everybody asks what it's about, or when it's out, or who's on it." She said, "He asked what I want it to feel like." She said, "I talked for 19 minutes. Monday, yesterday. She said, "He asked me if I was sleeping." And she said, and I said yes. And then I said, "Actually, no. I've slept 3 nights out of the last 20. She said, and he said, "Okay, tell me about the 20. And she said, "So I did." She said, "I told him about 4:30 in the morning, about picking up the phone sounding awake, about all of it." I said, "What did he say?" And she said, "He said, 'I'm so sorry.' And then he didn't say anything for a while. And then he said, 'We're changing the call time.'" She said, and I said, "The call time is fine." And she said, and he said, and this is what got me. He said, "Taylor, I'm not asking. I'm not asking." 3 words. My son, who has spent 3 years being the most accommodating man alive to a woman who does not know how to ask for things, finally told her no. She said, "Donna, he's never done that." I said, "I know." She said, "He's never once told me what we're doing." And I said, "He's learning." And she said, "I liked it." And then she said, very quietly, "I liked it so much." The call is now at 7 in the morning her time. He gets up 40 minutes earlier to do it. He does not tell anybody at camp why. He goes outside the dormitory in St. Joseph, Missouri, at 1 in the morning Central Time, and sits on a bench in the dark and calls England. He has done it for 6 days. She said, "He sits outside. I can hear the crickets." She said, "I've started listening for them." 26 days is now 32. I want to say that plainly, because it is the truth, and because I am not going to pretend the rules fix the geography. They are still apart. She is still in England. He is still in a dormitory in Missouri, eating institutional food and getting hit by professional athletes every morning. The 10-day rule is broken, and it is going to stay broken until the second week of September, and both of them know it, and they have talked about it out loud now, instead of being generous at each other about it. That is the actual repair. Not the reunion, the talking about it. She said something to me on the phone yesterday that I want to end this part on. She said, "I think I understand why yours was 1 rule and ours is 4. I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because you and Ed were in the same house. You could do the rest without saying it. You could put a hand on somebody's back." She said, "We don't have that. So we have to say all of it out loud. All of it. Every part that people who live together get to do with their bodies, we have to do with words." She said, "And honestly, Donna, I think that might make us better at it eventually." I said, "It will." She said, "You think?" And I said, "I know. Because the couples who have to say everything out loud are the only ones who ever actually know each other." I want to tell you what is going to happen, because it is already scheduled, and because I think you deserve to know that this story has an end date. September 14th, Kansas City, Arrowhead Stadium. The Chiefs open the season against Denver. Taylor will be there. That is not speculation, and it is not a rumor. She told me herself. Her London commitments end on the 11th, and she is on a plane on the 12th, and she will be at Arrowhead on the 14th. That will be day 46. 46 days. Against a rule that says 10. I asked her about it. I said, "Does the 10-day rule survive this?" And she said something that I thought was very smart. She said, "The rule didn't fail. The rule did exactly what it was supposed to do." I said, "It got broken by 36 days. And she said, "Yes. And because we had it, we both knew it was being broken. Every single day. It was a number sitting there getting bigger." She said, "If we hadn't had the rule, we would have looked up in October and gone, 'Huh, when did we last see each other?'" She said, "The rule didn't keep us together. The rule kept us aware." Then she said, "That's what rules are for. Not to be unbreakable. To make it impossible to not notice." I have thought about that a great deal. Rules are not for being unbreakable. Rules are for making it impossible to not notice. That is a better sentence about marriage than anything I came up with in 50 years. I asked her what she is going to do when she sees him. She said, "I don't know. Cry, probably." I said, "At Arrowhead? In front of 76,000 people?" And she said, "Donna, I've cried at Arrowhead before." Which is true, and which made me laugh. Then she said, "Actually, I do know one thing I'm going to do." I said, "What?" And she said, "I'm going to ask him what the light's like." She said, "He'll be standing right in front of me, and I'm going to ask him anyway." And I said, "He'll know exactly what you mean." And she said, "I know he will. That's the point." I want to say one more thing about my son, because he has been a supporting character in his own story here, and that is not fair to him. Travis called me on Sunday. He said, "Mom, did Taylor call you?" I said, "Yes." He said, "At 3 in the morning?" I said, "Yes." And there was a pause. And he said, "I hate that I wasn't the one she called." Now, I want to be careful here, because a lesser man says that as an accusation. A lesser man says that, and it becomes about him. That is not how he said it. He said it flat and sad and completely without blame, the way you say a true thing about yourself that you do not like. And then he said, "I know why she didn't. I was the thing she was protecting." I said, "Yes." He said, "I don't want to be a thing she protects." And I said, "Travis, everybody protects the people they love. You did the exact same thing to her for a week." And he said, "I know. That's what I'm saying. We were both doing it." Then he said, "I don't want a marriage where we're both being nice to each other in a way that means we're not telling each other anything." He said, "I saw that. Growing up. Not with you and Dad, I don't mean that. But I saw it. I've been in a lot of houses." He said, "Everybody's polite, and nobody knows anything. And I sat there in Cleveland, with the phone against my face, and did not say anything, because I had been in that house, in 1996, with him and his brother asleep upstairs, and he had not known it, and he still does not know it, and I have never told him. I told his wife instead. I do not entirely know why I did that, except that she asked, and he never has. I want to address the other thing, because it is out there and because I have been asked about it 4 times in the last 2 weeks, and I have smiled and said nothing every time. People are writing that this marriage is in trouble. Not everybody, but it is out there. There is a version of this circulating that goes, they got married in July, and by August she was in another country, and he was in a dormitory in Missouri, and isn't that interesting? There have been pieces about how she has not been photographed at camp. There have been pieces counting the days. Somebody did a thing about her being out with friends in London on the 12th and made a point of noting that her husband was not there. Her husband was at a football practice in Missouri. That is where football players are in August. This is not a mystery that requires investigation. I have been in this family's public life for a long time now, and I have developed a fairly thick skin about most of it. This one bothers me. It bothers me because those two people are currently working harder at their marriage than any couple I have ever personally observed, including my own, and they are doing it entirely in private, in 4-minute phone calls at 1 in the morning Central Time from a bench outside a dormitory. And the read from outside is, trouble. They have never once been photographed working on this. There is no picture of my son sitting on a bench in the dark in St. Joseph, Missouri, asking his wife what the light is like in a room 4,000 miles away. That is the actual marriage, and it is invisible. I want to say something to anybody who has read one of those pieces and half believed it, because I do not think most people are being malicious. I think most people just do not have the information. Distance is not a symptom. Distance is a logistics problem. It is a calendar. It is two people with careers that require them to be physically located in specific places at specific times. The symptom is not how far apart people are. The symptom is what the phone calls sound like. And I have been told, in detail, by both of them, what these phone calls sound like. They sound like, "What's the light like in there?" They sound like, "What are you afraid of this season?" They sound like 11 minutes about something a man has never said to his brother or his father or his mother. I would trade a great many marriages I have seen in 50 years for that. So that is the answer. My daughter-in-law has not slept in the same room as my son in 32 days. There is nothing wrong. There is an ocean, and a football schedule, and two extremely considerate people who almost let their own consideration hollow out their marriage in 3 weeks and caught it on day 26 because one of them was watching for it. And there are 4 rules on a card, 3 of them in her handwriting, and 1 of them in his, which is genuinely illegible. And there is a woman in Cleveland, Ohio, who told a story at a kitchen table in May about a Tuesday afternoon in 1996 and did not know she was handing over an instruction. That is all this is. That is the whole thing. There is one more thing that happened, and it happened this morning, and it is the reason this story got told today instead of next week. I called Travis. Not about Taylor, about 1996. I want to describe what that took, because I do not want anybody to think it was easy or that I am some brave woman. I sat in my kitchen for about 40 minutes with the phone in my hand before I did it. Ed came through at one point and saw me sitting there and did not say anything. He just put his hand on my shoulder for a second on his way past. Then I called my son. He picked up and said, "Hey, everything okay?" And I said, "I need to tell you something about your father and me." And he said, "Oh God, is he?" And I said, "No, no, he's fine. Everybody's fine. It's about a long time ago." And then I told him. All of it, same as I told her. The 18 months, the efficiency, The 4 months of logistical questions, the flu, the 40 seconds on the edge of the bed where I could not think of one thing to say to my own husband, the 8 inches. Come here. Travis did not say a single word for the entire thing. I know, because I kept checking that the call had not dropped. When I finished, there was a silence that went on long enough that I said his name, and he said, "I'm here," and his voice was completely wrecked. He said, "What year?" I said, 96, 97, somewhere in there. He said, "I was 7. I said, "Yes." And he said, "Mom, I remember that house." He said, "I remember it being quiet." I did not know what to do with that. I still do not. I have spent 30 years believing that those two boys did not notice anything, that whatever was happening between Ed and me had been kept entirely between Ed and me, that the house was normal because we made it normal. He was 7. He remembers it being quiet. He said, "I'm not saying it was bad. It wasn't bad. I had a great childhood, Mom. I've said that 100 times in public, and I meant it every time." He said, "I just remember there being a stretch where the house had less noise in it, and then at some point, it had noise again." He said, "I never thought about it once until right now." Then he said the thing that ended me. He said, "Is that why you told her?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And I sat in my kitchen in Cleveland, Ohio, at 73 years old, and gave my son the most honest answer I had. I said, "Because you never asked and she did." Silence. And then Travis Kelce said, "That's fair." He said, "That's completely fair, and I don't like it." And I said, "I know." And he said, "I'm going to ask more." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "I mean it. I'm going to ask you things." And I said, "I know you mean it. You've got a wife who does it, so you'll learn it." And he said, "She does do that." And I said, "Yes, she does." And he said, "She's the only person who's ever asked me anything." Then he said, "Except you." And I said, "That's my job." And Travis said, "It's hers now, too." We talked for a while after that. Not about anything heavy. He told me about camp and about a rookie who is apparently terrible at one specific thing and hilarious about it. And right before he hung up, he said, "Hey, Mom." I said, "Yes." And he said, "Does Dad know you told me?" And I said, "He told me to." And there was a pause. And Travis said, "Of course he did." And then he said, "I'm going to call him." And he hung up on me to call his father, which is the second time in this family's recent history that somebody has hung up on me to call somebody they love, and both times I have sat afterward looking at a dark phone screen, feeling like the luckiest woman in Ohio. One last part. Yesterday I got a text from Taylor. Just a photograph, no words. It was a picture of a window in a room in London. Late light coming through it. The specific gold that late summer evening light does. I did not understand it for about 10 seconds. And then I did. She had sent me the light. She is answering a 4-minute phone call from 6 days ago by showing her mother-in-law in Ohio what the light looks like in the room she is in. I wrote back, "It's beautiful." And she wrote, "He says the same thing about the ceiling in his dorm room, and I know he's lying." And then she wrote, "I miss him so much I can't stand it." And I wrote, 11 more days. And she wrote, 11 more days. I want to say one thing to the women listening, because I know who is listening. I read what you write to me. A lot of you have been married for 30 and 40 and 50 years. A lot of you have raised children and run households and gotten extremely, extremely good at it. And I suspect that some of you are in the efficient part right now. I am not going to tell you that you are. I do not know your marriage. But I will give you the test, because it is the only one I have, and because it cost me 18 months to learn it. Tonight, when you are in the same room as the person you married, try to think of a question to ask them that is not about the day. Not what time is the thing. Not did you call about the appointment. Not what do you want for dinner. Something else. Anything else. If one comes to you easily, you are fine. Go on about your evening. God bless you both. If you sit there for a while and cannot find one, I am not saying anything is wrong. I am saying, notice it. Just notice it. That is all I did in 1996. I noticed for 40 seconds on the edge of a bed, and then a man with a fever said hi, and I fell apart, and that was the beginning of the next 30 years. You do not have to fix it tonight. You just have to notice. And then, at some point, when it feels possible, you have to say something out loud. Which is the hard part, and which is the part I could not do for 18 months, and which a 36-year-old woman in London did at 3 in the morning after 26 days because she had a name for what she was looking at. She had a name for it because somebody told her. Now you have one too. I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law, and I have been married for a very long time, and the thing nobody tells you is that the danger is almost never the fighting. The danger is the efficiency. The danger is two people who love each other very much, running a household or a marriage or an ocean between two countries, being so competent about it that they forget to ask each other what the light looks like. Ask. Every night. Something that is not about the day. That is the whole thing. That is everything I know after 50 years, given to a young woman at a kitchen table in May, and returned to me last week as a photograph of a window. Thank you for sitting with me today.